Sometimes life doesn't ask permission before it changes everything. One phone call, one knock at the door, one moment of silence where laughter used to live, and suddenly, you're standing in someone else's shoes, wondering if you'll ever fill them right. Marcus Thompson never imagined that at 28, he'd be packing school lunches, checking homework, and learning that love isn't just something you feel, it's something you choose every single day, even when you're scared you're not enough. This is the story of a man who thought he was saving 3 children, only to discover they were saving him right back. It's about finding family in the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the person you've been waiting for your whole life walks through your door carrying nothing but warm bread and hope for tomorrow. Marcus Thompson was in the middle of installing a kitchen cabinet when his phone rang. The sound echoed through the empty house he was renovating, cutting through the peaceful quiet of his Tuesday afternoon. He almost didn't answer it. His hands were covered in sawdust, and he was finally making good progress on the project that had been dragging on for weeks. But something about the persistent ringing made him stop and reach for the device. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman he didn't recognize, someone from Child Protective Services. Her words came at him like scattered pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. There had been an accident. His brother David and sister-in-law Jennifer were gone. 3 children needed somewhere to go. Emergency placement. Temporary arrangement. Family first option. Marcus found himself sitting on a stack of 2x4s in the half-finished kitchen, staring at the wall where he'd been planning to install a window. The woman was still talking, explaining procedures and paperwork and something about a home visit, but her voice seemed to be coming from very far away. He kept thinking about the last time he'd seen David, maybe 6 months ago at their mother's birthday dinner. They'd argued about something stupid, the way brothers do. David had stormed out early, and Marcus had been too stubborn to call and make things right. Now he never could. The children were staying with a foster family temporarily, the woman explained. 8-year-old Emma, 6-year-old Tyler, and 3-year-old Sophie. Marcus had met them only a handful of times over the years. David and Jennifer had moved to Phoenix for work when Emma was still a baby, and the distance had made family visits rare and awkward. Marcus remembered Emma as a quiet girl who clung to her mother's leg, Tyler as a bundle of energy who couldn't sit still through dinner, and Sophie as barely more than a baby who'd cried through most of their last meeting. The social worker was asking him questions now. Did he have a stable living situation? Steady income? Experience with children? Marcus looked around at his current project, a modest 3-bedroom house he'd bought as a fixer-upper with plans to flip. The kitchen was gutted, the master bathroom was in pieces, and he was living out of the guest room with a hot plate and a mini fridge. His contracting business was doing well enough, but his schedule was unpredictable, and he often worked late into the evening. Experience with children? The honest answer was no, not really. He'd never been married, never had kids of his own. At 28, most of his friends were still figuring out their own lives, and Marcus had been content with his routine of work, weekend basketball games with college buddies, and the occasional date that never seemed to lead anywhere serious. He liked his independence, liked being able to pick up and travel or take on a big project without having to consider anyone else's needs. But these weren't just any children. They were David's children, his brother's kids, who had no one else in the world now except strangers in the system. The social worker gave him 24 hours to decide. That evening, Marcus called his mother in Ohio. She was already crying before he finished explaining what had happened. Through her tears, she told him she wished she could take the children herself, but her arthritis was getting worse, and she was barely managing to take care of her own small apartment. She asked him what he was going to do, and Marcus realized he'd been hoping she would have an answer for him. After hanging up, he drove to the local diner where he usually grabbed dinner when he was too tired to cook. Betty, the waitress who'd been working there since before he was born, took one look at his face and brought him coffee without asking. She sat across from him in the empty booth and listened while he explained the situation. "Those babies need someone who loves them," she said when he finished. "Money and experience and all that other stuff you can figure out as you go. But love? That's something you either have or you don't." Marcus stared into his coffee cup, trying to imagine what his life would look like with 3 young children in it. No more quiet evenings working on projects. No more spontaneous weekend trips. No more freedom to make decisions based only on what he wanted to do. Everything would have to change. But then he thought about David and Jennifer and how they'd looked at their children with such fierce, protective love. He thought about those kids waking up in a stranger's house, wondering where their parents were and why they weren't coming back. He thought about them being separated, placed in different homes, because finding one family willing to take 3 children together would be nearly impossible. That night, he called the social worker back. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and inspections and emergency shopping trips. The home visit went better than expected, partly because Marcus was honest about his limitations and partly because the alternative for the children was far from ideal. The social worker, Mrs. Rodriguez, seemed impressed by his commitment to keeping the siblings together and his willingness to make whatever changes were necessary to provide a stable home. The house needed work, but it was structurally sound and had enough bedrooms. Marcus spent his emergency fund on basics: beds, clothes, toys, and enough groceries to feed 3 growing children. He read articles online about child development and discipline and nutrition, feeling overwhelmed by how much he didn't know. He also discovered that David and Jennifer had managed their finances carefully. There was a modest life insurance policy that would help with the children's expenses, and they'd set up education funds for each child. It wasn't enough to make raising 3 kids easy, but it was something. The day he picked up the children was gray and cold, with the kind of drizzling rain that made everything look gloomy. The foster family was kind but clearly relieved to be ending their temporary obligation. Emma sat in the corner with a backpack clutched to her chest, her dark eyes watching every movement with the careful attention of someone much older than 8. Tyler was bouncing off the walls despite the somber circumstances, asking a million questions about where they were going and when they could see their parents again. Sophie clung to a stuffed elephant and cried whenever anyone tried to separate her from it. Marcus loaded their few belongings into his truck and tried to think of something reassuring to say. But what could he tell them? That everything would be okay? That he would take care of them? That they were safe now? All of those things felt like promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Instead, he knelt down to their level and said, "I know this is scary, and I know you want your mom and dad. I can't bring them back, but I can promise you that I'm going to do my best to take care of you. We're family, and families stick together." Emma nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of what he was saying. Tyler asked if they could get McDonald's for lunch, because apparently grief hadn't affected his appetite. And Sophie just stared at him with big brown eyes that reminded him painfully of David. The drive to his house took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Marcus found himself glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking on the 3 children who had just become his responsibility. Emma sat perfectly still, staring out the window. Tyler kept asking questions about everything they passed. Sophie had fallen asleep, clutching her elephant. When they arrived at the house, Marcus realized he'd been so focused on getting the basics ready that he hadn't thought about how the place would look to them. The front yard was overgrown, and the porch steps were slightly crooked. Inside, everything smelled like fresh paint and sawdust. The living room had a couch and a television, but no coffee table because he'd been using it as a workbench in the garage. The kitchen had working appliances, but no table yet, just a couple of folding chairs he'd borrowed from a neighbor. It wasn't much, but it was clean and warm and safe. Emma looked around with that same serious expression and asked where her room would be. Marcus showed them upstairs to the bedrooms he'd hastily prepared. Emma and Sophie would share the larger room, with twin beds and a dresser he'd assembled the night before. Tyler got the smaller room to himself, which seemed to delight him more than anything else about the situation. That first night was harder than Marcus had expected. Sophie cried for 2 hours, asking for her mama over and over again. Tyler had a nightmare and ended up crawling into bed with Marcus, shivering and confused. Emma stayed in her room, but didn't sleep. Marcus could hear her moving around, unpacking and repacking her few belongings as if she was trying to make the space feel like home. Marcus lay awake long after the children had finally settled down, staring at the ceiling and wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Tomorrow he'd have to figure out school enrollment and find a babysitter and somehow managed to keep his business running while learning how to be a parent to 3 grieving children. But when he got up to check on them one more time before trying to sleep, he found Emma sitting on the floor between the 2 beds, holding Sophie's hand while she slept. The sight hit him like a physical blow, the fierce protectiveness of an 8-year-old girl trying to comfort her baby sister in a world that had suddenly become uncertain and scary. That's when Marcus knew, with complete certainty, that he'd made the right decision. These children needed him, and maybe, though he wasn't ready to admit it yet, he needed them too. The next morning brought new challenges. Sophie refused to eat anything but crackers. Tyler couldn't find his favorite toy car and had a meltdown that lasted 45 minutes. Emma tried to help by making breakfast, nearly setting off the smoke alarm in the process. Marcus found himself apologizing to neighbors he barely knew for the noise, Googling how to stop a 3-year-old from crying, and calling his mother for advice about everything from lunch ideas to bedtime routines. It was chaos, but it was their chaos now. By the end of the first week, they'd established a rough routine. Emma had started at the local elementary school and seemed to be adjusting well, though her teacher called to express concern about how withdrawn she was. Tyler was enrolled in kindergarten, but had already gotten in trouble twice for not sitting still during story time. Sophie stayed with Mrs. Patterson, an elderly neighbor who'd offered to help with childcare, though she spent most of the day asking for her parents and crying when they didn't come. Marcus had to turn down 2 big renovation projects because the schedule wouldn't work with his new responsibilities. His savings account was shrinking faster than he'd expected, despite the life insurance money. And he was exhausted in a way he'd never experienced before, the bone-deep tiredness that came from being responsible for other people's needs 24 hours a day. But there were small victories too. Sophie had started sleeping through the night. Tyler had made a friend at school. Emma had smiled once, just once, when Marcus burned dinner so badly they had to order pizza instead. They were far from being a real family, but they were learning to live together, to depend on each other in small ways. Marcus was beginning to think they might actually figure this out when the real challenges began. 3 weeks into their new life together, Marcus discovered that raising children was nothing like the parenting articles he'd been frantically reading online. The books talked about consistent routines and positive reinforcement and the importance of emotional support, but they didn't explain how to handle a 6-year-old who decided he hated vegetables so much that he'd rather go to bed hungry than eat a single green bean. They didn't offer strategies for convincing a 3-year-old that bath time wasn't a form of torture, or how to help an 8-year-old who'd stopped talking about her feelings entirely. Emma had become the family's unofficial supervisor, trying to take care of her younger siblings with a seriousness that broke Marcus's heart. She would wake up early to help Sophie get dressed, remind Tyler to brush his teeth, and pack everyone's lunch without being asked. When Marcus tried to tell her that these weren't her responsibilities, she would just look at him with those grave, dark eyes and say, "Mama always said I was the big sister." The weight of that responsibility was too much for any 8-year-old, but Marcus wasn't sure how to convince her to let him handle more of the daily care. Every time he tried to step in, Emma would hover anxiously nearby, ready to jump in if he did something wrong. It was as if she didn't quite trust that he would stick around, that he wouldn't disappear like her parents had. Tyler, meanwhile, was acting out in ways that kept Marcus constantly on edge. The energetic boy had always been active, but now his energy seemed frantic and destructive. He would build elaborate towers with his blocks just to knock them down violently. He picked fights with kids at school and had already been sent to the principal's office twice. At home, he tested every boundary Marcus tried to set, as if he was trying to see how much trouble it would take to make Marcus give up on them too. And Sophie, sweet little Sophie, was stuck somewhere between being a normal 3-year-old and being a child who'd experienced loss too big for her to understand. She would play happily for hours with her toys, chattering to herself in the nonsensical way that made Marcus smile. But then, she'd suddenly remember that something was missing. She'd look around the room with confused eyes and ask, "Where Mama? Where Daddy?" in a voice so small and hopeful that it made Marcus want to punch something. The worst part was that he couldn't give any of them the one thing they really wanted. He couldn't bring back their parents. He couldn't make their world safe and predictable again. All he could do was show up every day and try to love them enough to fill some of the empty spaces, even when he felt like he was failing. His mother called every few days to check on them, and Marcus found himself editing his reports to sound more positive than the reality. Yes, the children were adjusting. Yes, school was going well. No, he wasn't overwhelmed. The truth was more complicated. Some days felt like victories when everyone made it through without major meltdowns. Other days felt like disasters when nothing he tried seemed to help. Mrs. Rodriguez, the social worker, visited every 2 weeks to check on their progress. She was kind but thorough, asking the children questions about how they felt and whether Marcus was taking good care of them. Emma always spoke carefully during these visits, as if she was worried that the wrong answer might mean they'd have to leave. Tyler would show off his latest drawings and talk about his new friends, seeming to forget that these visits were evaluations rather than social calls. Sophie usually hid behind Marcus's legs and wouldn't speak at all. After each visit, Marcus would lie awake wondering if he was doing enough, if he was the right person for this enormous responsibility. The children deserved someone who knew what they were doing, someone who could help them process their grief and build a stable, happy life. Instead, they had him, a bachelor who'd never changed a diaper before 3 weeks ago, and who sometimes felt like he was drowning in the daily logistics of keeping 3 children fed, cleaned, and emotionally supported. But then, there would be moments that made him think they might be okay after all. Like the evening when Tyler came running into the kitchen, excited to show Marcus a picture he'd drawn at school. It was a crayon drawing of a house with 4 stick figures in front of it. When Marcus asked who the people were, Tyler pointed to each one in turn. "That's Emma, that's Sophie, that's me, and that's you, Uncle Marcus. We're a family now." Or the morning when Sophie crawled into his bed at dawn and fell back asleep curled up against his side, trusting him completely to keep her safe while she dreamed. Or the afternoon when Emma finally broke down and cried about missing her parents, and let Marcus hold her while she sobbed, instead of trying to handle everything alone. These moments reminded him that love wasn't just about knowing the right thing to do. Sometimes it was about being willing to figure it out as you went, about showing up consistently even when you felt clueless and overwhelmed. Marcus had always been a practical person, someone who approached problems with tools and research and systematic solutions. But parenting, he was learning, required a different kind of skill set. It was less about having all the answers and more about being present for the questions, less about preventing every possible hurt, and more about helping them heal when hurt happened anyway. The children's grief came in waves, unpredictable and intense. Emma would have nightmares about car accidents and wake up panicked and disoriented. Tyler would suddenly start crying in the middle of playing, overwhelmed by sadness he couldn't explain. Sophie would look for her parents in every room of the house, calling their names with increasing urgency until Marcus or Emma could distract her with something else. Marcus did his best to comfort them, but he felt inadequate for such a monumental task. How do you explain death to a 3-year-old? How do you help a 6-year-old understand why bad things happen to good people? How do you convince an 8-year-old that it's okay to be a child sometimes, that she doesn't have to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders? He bought books about helping children cope with loss and attended a support group for guardians of orphaned children. The other adults in the group were mostly grandparents or aunts and uncles who'd found themselves in similar situations. Their stories were both comforting and heartbreaking, reminders that Marcus wasn't alone in feeling unprepared for this responsibility, but also that the challenges he was facing were very real and wouldn't be solved quickly. One woman, Sarah, had been raising her sister's 2 children for 3 years after a drug overdose. She told Marcus that the first year was the hardest, that it took time for everyone to adjust to their new roles and learn to trust each other. A man named Robert had taken in his nephew after his brother died in military service. He shared strategies for helping children maintain connections to their deceased parents while still allowing new relationships to form. These conversations helped Marcus realize that he didn't have to have all the answers immediately. The goal wasn't to replace David and Jennifer, but to create something new and different that could still be loving and stable and good. He started incorporating memories of the children's parents into their daily routine, encouraging them to share stories about family traditions and happy times. Emma remembered that her mother always made pancakes on Saturday mornings. So Marcus learned to make pancakes, even though his first attempts were disasters that made the children laugh harder than they had since before the accident. Tyler talked about how his father used to take him to the park to feed the ducks, so Marcus found a local pond where they could continue that tradition. These small acts of remembrance seemed to help the children feel less like they'd lost their entire world, and more like they were building something new that still included the love their parents had given them. Marcus also had to learn practical skills he'd never needed before. How to braid Emma's hair for school, though his attempts looked nothing like the neat styles Jennifer had created. How to cut food into small pieces for Sophie and convince her to eat vegetables by making airplane noises. How to help Tyler with homework without doing it for him. And how to enforce bedtimes without turning every evening into a battle. His house began to transform from a bachelor's renovation project into an actual home. The living room filled up with toys and children's books. The refrigerator became covered with artwork and school announcements and grocery lists written in Emma's careful handwriting. The bathroom counter overflowed with colorful toothbrushes and bubble bath and hair accessories. Marcus had to give up his dream of flipping the house for profit. Instead, he focused on making it truly livable for a family. He installed safety latches on cabinets and bought a dining table big enough for 4 people. He set up a small desk in the living room where Emma could do homework while he kept an eye on the younger children. He child-proofed outlets and secured furniture to walls and learned that 3 children could create more chaos in 10 minutes than he'd previously thought possible. His work schedule became more complicated as well. He had to turn down jobs that required evening or weekend hours, and he found contractors who were willing to work flexible schedules so he could pick up children from school and attend parent-teacher conferences. His income took a hit, but the life insurance money helped bridge the gap, and Marcus discovered that having less flexibility in his work schedule actually made him more efficient during the hours he could work. The social worker visits became easier as the weeks passed. Mrs. Rodriguez could see that the children were adjusting, that they felt safe and cared for even if they weren't completely healed yet. Emma started speaking more freely during these meetings, talking about her friends at school and the books Marcus read to them at bedtime. Tyler would drag Mrs. Rodriguez around the house to show her his room and his toys and the pictures he'd drawn. Sophie began sitting on the couch next to Marcus during visits instead of hiding behind him. But just as Marcus was starting to feel like they might actually figure out this makeshift family arrangement, new challenges emerged that tested his commitment and forced him to confront the limitations of what he could provide for these children on his own. Emma started having trouble in school. Her teacher called to report that she was falling behind in reading and seemed distracted during lessons. When Marcus asked her about it, Emma just shrugged and said school was fine, but he could see the worry in her eyes. She was trying so hard to be perfect, to never cause any trouble, that she wasn't asking for help when she needed it. Tyler's behavior problems escalated. He got into a fight with another boy and came home with a black eye and a note from the principal. When Marcus tried to talk to him about it, Tyler exploded into tears and anger, saying he hated his new school and wanted to go home. Except home didn't exist anymore. The raw pain in his voice made Marcus's chest tight with helplessness. And Sophie, who'd been making progress, suddenly regressed. She started wetting the bed again and refused to let Marcus out of her sight. If he went to the bathroom, she would stand outside the door crying. If he tried to put her down for a nap, she would scream until he stayed in the room with her. It was as if she'd suddenly realized that people she loved could disappear, and she was terrified of letting Marcus out of her sight long enough for it to happen again. Marcus found himself stretched thin, trying to meet each child's needs while managing his work and the household and his own emotional exhaustion. He was getting 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, and he'd lost weight because he often forgot to eat until the children were in bed, and he was too tired to bother with a real meal. His friends from before began to fade away, not out of meanness, but because his life had become so different from theirs that they no longer had much in common. He couldn't join them for spontaneous weekend trips or Thursday night basketball or the kind of carefree socializing that had once filled his evenings. When they did try to include him, he had to decline more often than not because of the children's schedules and needs. Marcus began to understand why single parents often felt isolated. It wasn't just the practical limitations on his time and energy. It was the way that caring for children changed his entire perspective on what mattered and how he wanted to spend his time. The concerns that had once seemed important, like whether his team won their game or whether he should buy a newer truck, felt trivial compared to helping Emma with her reading or finding a way to make Tyler feel safe enough to sleep through the night. He was proud of the progress they'd all made, but he was also honest enough to admit that he was struggling. The children needed more than one person could provide. They needed the kind of support system that families built over years, with grandparents and aunts and uncles and family friends who all played different roles in helping children grow up feeling loved and secure. Marcus had been so focused on proving that he could handle this responsibility on his own that he hadn't thought much about building that broader network of support. But as the weeks turned into months, he began to realize that doing everything alone wasn't just exhausting for him. It wasn't fair to the children either. They deserved to have multiple adults in their lives who cared about them, who could offer different kinds of guidance and support and love. The problem was that Marcus didn't know how to build that kind of community. He'd always been somewhat of a loner, comfortable with his small circle of friends and his independence. Now he needed to learn how to let people into their lives, how to trust others with the children's care and well-being, how to accept help without feeling like he was admitting failure. It was a lesson he was about to learn in the most unexpected way possible. The first time Marcus saw her, she was chasing a runaway grocery bag across his front yard. It was a Tuesday evening in late March, and he'd just pulled into the driveway after picking up the children from their various activities. Emma had stayed after school for tutoring, Tyler had soccer practice, and Sophie had spent the day with Mrs. Patterson, who was starting to hint that watching a 3-year-old 5 days a week was becoming too much for her arthritis. Marcus was tired in that bone-deep way that had become his normal state, trying to juggle grocery bags and backpacks and Sophie's diaper bag, while 3 children asked him questions about dinner and homework and whether they could watch cartoons before bed. He was so focused on getting everyone inside before Sophie had a meltdown that he almost didn't notice the woman chasing a paper bag that was rolling across his lawn in the spring breeze. She was laughing as she caught up to it, a sound that made Marcus pause even in his exhaustion. When was the last time he'd heard an adult laugh with such genuine enjoyment over something so simple? She scooped up the bag and turned toward him with a smile that seemed to light up the gray evening. "Sorry about that," she called out, walking over to where he stood surrounded by children and chaos. "I'm still getting used to the wind patterns in this neighborhood. I'm Elena Rodriguez, by the way. I just moved into the house next door." Marcus realized he'd seen moving trucks a few days earlier, but had been too preoccupied with his own daily survival to pay much attention. Now he took in his new neighbor properly. She was probably around his age, with curly dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. There was something about her presence that felt calm and warm, a stark contrast to the perpetual state of barely controlled chaos that had become his life. "Marcus Thompson," he said, shifting Sophie to his other hip so he could extend a hand. "And this is Emma, Tyler, and Sophie." Elena's smile grew warmer as she looked at the children. "It's nice to meet all of you. I work at the Children's Hospital downtown, so I'm always happy to meet young neighbors." Emma, who had become shy around new adults since her parents' death, stepped a little closer to Marcus but managed a small wave. Tyler, never one to meet a stranger, immediately launched into a detailed explanation of why his soccer uniform was muddy and how he'd scored 2 goals during practice. Sophie just stared with wide eyes, one thumb finding its way to her mouth. "Well, I should let you get these little ones inside," Elena said after Tyler finished his soccer report. "But maybe sometime soon you could all come over for dinner. I love to cook, and it's not nearly as fun when you're just cooking for one person." The invitation caught Marcus off guard. It had been months since anyone had offered to help in any way, let alone invited them for a meal. Most people, he'd discovered, were uncomfortable around the children's obvious grief and his own uncertainty about how to handle it. They would make sympathetic noises about his situation, but then, quickly change the subject or find reasons to end conversations. That's very kind of you, Marcus said, not quite knowing how to accept such an offer. But 3 kids can be a lot to handle, especially at dinner time. Elena laughed again, that same warm sound that had caught his attention. I have 4 nephews under the age of 10. Trust me, I know what dinner with children looks like. Besides, everyone needs neighbors they can count on. That night, after the children were finally in bed, Marcus found himself thinking about Elena's easy confidence around the kids and her casual offer of friendship. He'd gotten so used to handling everything alone that the idea of accepting help felt foreign and slightly uncomfortable. What if the children misbehaved? What if Sophie had one of her crying fits? What if Tyler said something inappropriate about their parents being dead, the way he sometimes did when he was trying to process what had happened to his family? But there had been something genuine about Elena's invitation, something that suggested she wasn't just being polite. And if she really did work at a children's hospital, maybe she would understand that grief made kids act out sometimes, that healing wasn't a straight line from sadness to okay. A few days later, Marcus was struggling with one of those evenings where everything seemed to go wrong at once. Sophie had refused to eat anything except crackers for dinner. Tyler had accidentally broken a lamp while playing indoor soccer despite being told repeatedly to take the ball outside. And Emma had started crying over her math homework for reasons she couldn't or wouldn't explain. Marcus was sitting on the kitchen floor with Sophie on his lap, trying to convince her to eat just one bite of the chicken he'd made, when there was a knock at the door. He considered ignoring it, since getting up would likely result in Sophie screaming and Tyler taking the opportunity to retrieve his confiscated soccer ball. But the knocking persisted in a polite but determined way. With Sophie still clinging to him, Marcus opened the door to find Elena standing on his porch with a covered dish that smelled incredible. I hope this isn't a bad time, she said, taking in his frazzled appearance and the sounds of chaos coming from behind him. I made too much lasagna, and I thought maybe you could use a break from cooking tonight. Marcus almost started crying right there on his doorstep. The kindness of the gesture, combined with his exhaustion and the smell of real, homemade food, nearly undid him completely. Actually, he said, his voice a little rough, this might be the perfect time. Elena stepped inside and immediately assessed the situation with the calm efficiency of someone used to managing chaos. Within minutes, she had Tyler helping her set the table, Emma distracted from her homework crisis by questions about her favorite subjects in school, and Sophie curious enough about the new person to stop clinging to Marcus and investigate the wonderful smell coming from the casserole dish. The lasagna was perfect, the kind of comfort food that made everyone relax and stop fighting about eating vegetables. Tyler declared it the best dinner ever and asked Elena if she could teach Marcus how to make it. Emma actually smiled and asked for seconds. Sophie ate more real food than she had in days, too interested in watching their guest to remember that she was supposed to be picky. After dinner, Elena helped clean up despite Marcus's protests, chatting easily with the children about their schools and interests. She admired Tyler's soccer trophies, looked at Emma's latest library book, and managed to make Sophie laugh by doing silly voices while they cleared the table together. When it was time for the children's bedtime routine, Elena said goodnight and headed for the door, but not before Tyler asked if she could come back tomorrow, and Emma shyly invited her to see the garden they'd been planning to plant in the backyard. She's nice, Emma said as Marcus tucked her into bed later that evening. She smells like cookies, and she doesn't look sad when she talks to us. Marcus realized that Emma had picked up on something he'd been too overwhelmed to notice. Most adults did look sad when they interacted with the children, a kind of pitying sadness that made the kids feel like they were objects of sympathy rather than just regular children who happened to have experienced loss. Elena had treated them like any other kids, interested in their personalities and opinions without the weight of their tragic circumstances coloring every interaction. Over the next few weeks, Elena became a regular presence in their lives, though never in a way that felt intrusive or overwhelming. She would knock on the door some evenings with extra food, or offer to watch the children if Marcus needed to run errands, or simply chat over the fence while they were playing in the backyard. The children began to look forward to seeing her, and Marcus found himself grateful for adult conversation that wasn't focused on problems or responsibilities. Elena had a way of making ordinary moments feel special. She brought over ingredients to make homemade pizza one Saturday and let the children create their own individual pizzas with whatever toppings they wanted, resulting in some truly bizarre combinations that everyone enjoyed anyway. She helped Emma plant a small vegetable garden and taught her about which plants grew well together. She played soccer with Tyler in the backyard, patient with his enthusiastic but unrefined technique. She read picture books to Sophie with different voices for all the characters, making the little girl giggle in ways Marcus hadn't heard since before the accident. But Elena wasn't just wonderful with the children. She was easy company for Marcus too, someone who could talk about books and current events and the challenges of home renovation without making him feel like he had to be constantly entertaining or grateful. She had her own life and interests, working long shifts at the hospital and maintaining friendships and hobbies that had nothing to do with him or the children. But she seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with their little makeshift family, bringing a lightness and warmth that had been missing from their daily routine. Marcus found himself looking forward to seeing her,